And now we have Marowak. Marowak comes from bone-chilling origins, and I know most of you probably know which story I'm gonna bring up. That, of course, being the story from the original games, where the dead Marowak, who was killed by Team Rocket, becomes the ghost of the Pokemon Tower, leaving behind its child Cubone crying in the hands of Mr. Fuji. Now that'll bring a tear to even the most rugged trainer. Anyway, all is not sad, however, because Marowak eventually got a Alolan form, which is a ghost fire type, presumably based off of the original Ghost Marowak. While this sounds like a terrific backstory for an anime or a fantasy character, we're more interested in Marowak's competitive capabilities. So, how good was Marowak actually? And in this video, we'll be covering these competitive formats. Now in Gen 1, Marowak is sadly terrible in the unforgiving Gen 1 metagame. There isn't even anything it can do as a gimmick. It is unfortunately 100% outclassed by Sandslash in every way. It has weaker stats in everything except for defense, which is his one good stat and is equal to Sandslash, but since Sandslash has higher HP, Sandslash is bulkier in this regard. Marowak also lacks Swords Dance and coverage from Rock Slide. And although for some reason it can learn Blizzard and Fire Blast, that doesn't mean much coming from Marowak's horrendous special, which means it also folds to every Psychic and Blizzard running around in conjunction with its poor HP. It very often loses to every single Pokemon on the opposing team, outside of the occasional Jolteon, who can simply switch to anything else to deal with Marowak. There are much more better ground types to use, with even Sandslash being a worthwhile pseudo gimmick. So in the RBY metagame, Marowak is completely outclassed, but it's at least a decent pick for underuse. But that's okay, because GSC Marowak is one of the most unique Pokemon to ever exist. The addition of held items in Gen 2, which allows it to pack well over a 500 attack stat unboosted. Nothing else in the metagame comes close to that. And with that attack stat, that means by using a single Swords Dance, it reaches 999 attack. The only other Pokemon who are capable of this are Belly Drummers, who of course lose half of their health. In this regard, nothing else does what Marowak does. As a matter of fact, because of the way Gen 2 mechanics work, Swords Dance variants must make sure their attack DVs are from 15 to 13, because after the Swords Dance boost, they will roll over the 999 cap, thus having an attack stat of 5 or so, and as a result will do absolutely nothing. This also means that Marowak should not use Swords Dance twice. Marowak's origin started with the now classic combination of Jolt Whack, where Jolteon would try to pass agility to it, Marowak would Swords Dance, and the game could potentially be over right then and there, as everything in theory folded to an Earthquake, Rock Slide, or Hidden Power bug. Swords Dance was also fantastic because it meant it couldn't be stalled by Growl, and it has 16 more PP than Charm, meaning it was a real thorn to defensive teams. While Jolt Whack wasn't a bad strategy per se, it didn't exactly leave Marowak branded as a solid overall Pokemon, since it was now just that thing that could try to auto-win alongside Jolteon, but that was nowhere near a consistent strategy. Not only can Jolteon's passing be disrupted by common roars like Raikou and Steelix, Marowak also can't always receive the pass and then safely set up. In addition to this, there are also many common Pokemon that can withstand a 999 assault from Marowak. Skarmory can even take 2 of them, while Cloyster, Fortress, Suicune, Heracross, Snorlax, Miltank, and Umbreon have a chance to survive as well. Of course, there's still a chance for the strategy to work if you get a flinch from Rock Slide, which is a 27% chance when factoring accuracy, but it wasn't a consistent performer, and thus for a time Marowak was not yet viewed as a top tier contender. But despite being a seemingly one-trick offensive pony, Marowak also has defensive utility. Pure ground typing is excellent in this gen, and thus gives it great matchups against common Pokemon like Raikou, Tyranitar, Steelix, and Rhydon. Its typing also allows it to resist Rock Slide and not be weak to Earthquake, which is fantastic, and allows it to dish out a lot of damage to those using Quake Slide. Being immune to Thunder when it's one of the most common moves ever is also an incredible value. The question is though, how do you make use of these defensive attributes when Marowak is still slow, not that bulky, and most notably, barring the occasional Thief Pokemon, is the only Pokemon in the tier that does not prefer leftovers? Well, it turns out Marowak thrives and fits like a glove with 2 pieces of support that are huge facets of GSC: Paralysis and Stall Teams. Paralysis is fairly self-explanatory, but how are Stall Teams supposed to make use of Marowak? Well, it turns out that they are capable of supporting each other dearly. With Rest in the 4th slot, Marowak can make up for its lack of recovery, and the Stall Team's accompanying Heal Bell will wake it right up for another assault. These teams also almost always carry Rapid Spin to make up for Marowak's more severe than most Spikes weakness. Defensively, Marowak isn't going to be switching in a lot in order to wall things, but he provides provides some very neat tricks. Being immune to Thunder can help a stall team play around a vicious electric type, spamming it to try and snag key paralysis on the walls. Nothing scares out an opposing Raikou harder than Marowak, the only Pokemon in Overuse that can one-hit KO it outside of Explosion or Self-Destruct, and this can help when Raikou is chaining together roars like nobody's business. Marowak can provide an offensive way to threaten Snorlax when he's trying to zero in on the walls that can't hurt him, and as he's withering them away, suddenly he's face to face with Marowak. Now Snorlax is the one whose team is on the defensive against the threat. Indeed, this offensive capability is something many stall teams appreciate, and as hard as it may be to believe, stall teams don't dish out a lot of damage, and that can be exploited in many ways. Many of them rely solely on Snorlax, and while Snorlax is amazing of course, he also rarely will blow through an entire team uninhibited. Marowak gives him much needed support. Belly Drum Snorlax and Swords Dance Marowak is an insane amount of offense that's incredibly tough to wall, and stall teams of course make up for their offensive shortcomings with their excellent sturdy backbone. The 1-2 punch of Lax and Marowak will gang up on the opposing Skarmory, forcing a rest so that the other can go to town. Alternatively, Snorlax paralyzing stuff is also often just as good, if not better. Though Rest Marowak actually gains a relatively hard wall in Exeggutor, but many stall teams can fit in Pursuit, Umbreon, or Tyranitar, and alternatively, they can try to wall it unless it explodes. Plus, even a grass type like Exeggutor doesn't enjoy taking too many earthquakes or rock slides, which do equal damage. Overall, the point is, several of the most iconic GSC teams run Marowak to great effect, including one of the most well-known stall teams with Snorlax, Marowak, Starmie, Miltank, Skarmory, and Zapdos or Raikou, but it can definitely fit on many more. Now Marowak has some other options. Hidden Power Flying cuts into its bulk, but it can potentially catch Heracross, who has a tendency to be obnoxious for it. Fire Blast deals with Skarmory unboosted and can also surprise Fortress, which is usually not an awful interim measure. It even hits the rare Meganium that's usually a pretty good check, and Body Slam spreads its own paralysis. It's usable as both the 4th move on Swords Dance sets and on 4 attack variants. They can often be mix and match into sets, but it's worth mentioning that 4 attack Marowak is great because it doesn't really give up on any wall since it hits so hard. Unlike for example Machamp, who becomes totally helpless against Suicune and even Vaporeon. And spreading its own paralysis is also huge, and it probably won't end up sweeping, but it'll certainly tear a nasty hole. Not running Swords Dance also means it can utilize its maximum attack DV, which bumps its attack up a few %, but in some situations that can be key. Basically, Marowak's offense can be utilized however the player wants to. An early game wall breaker that can trade for something tough to break, a hit and runner that's unparalleled with the rest of the metagame, or an endgame sweeper. GSC Marowak is truly unique, and its special presence is part of what defines the beauty of the Overused metagame. In the 3rd generation, Marowak was not anywhere near a star player. However, he wasn't bad at all. Throughout the generation, he had a small niche alongside Agility and Baton Pass Zapdos to rid him of one of his major issues, which is speed. While Marowak is still unable to outpace Aerodactyl and Jolteon after an agility boost, he was not immediately threatened by them. And with a set of Swords Dance, Earthquake, Rock Slide, and Hidden Power Bug, Marowak was capable of crushing entire teams with levels of power most weren't prepared for. It could even use one of its signature moves, Bone Meringue, to deal with substitute variants of Tyranitar and Raikou. Accuracy notwithstanding, while not giving up any of Earthquake's power. Of course, this was not a consistently winning strategy used often by top tier players, and thus Marowak would be something you were more surprised to see than not. But it did exist. As a matter of fact, both Suicune made a habit of always running 8 speed EVs just to always outrun Jolly Marowak. Recently, certain players have taken a hit from GSC and tried to use Marowak on more traditional offensive teams. After all, it does have some excellent attributes. It's immune to sand, it isn't paper thin, it's immune to electric, it resists rock. Those are some tremendous attributes to have on a Pokemon in this meta. Of course, its low special bulk and speed were a problem, but that was fixed with the GSC style paralysis speed, with tremendous offensive Pokemon such as Zapdos, Snorlax, and Jirachi easily dishing it out. Thus, Marowak is a new and unique member of the quote-unquote real advanced metagame, as opposed to a Ninjask level gimmick. It's a real bruiser that can help your team out in a pinch defensively too. Checking Tyranitar is never a bad thing, and it tends to run Jolly now in order to outrun Milotic, Agility, Metagross, and many Dragon Dance Tyranitar. And although Celebi has natural cure for paralysis and even speedless defensive variants will outspeed Marowak, Celebi must always be careful of a Hidden Power Bug on Switch. The quintessential physical wall of this generation, Swampert, is absolutely destroyed by a +2 stab Thick Club Earthquake. Even the most physically bulky variants possible have a very real chance of being one-hit KO'd, and as can be surmised from that, even a danceless Earthquake is going to cause it incredible pain. With Skarmory taking a serious face pounding as well from a +2 rock slide. Marowak is easily capable of tearing open teams' backbones, or even sweeping slower teams. Even a max invested physically defensive Flygon has a very real chance of being 2-hit KO'd by a hidden power bug. But like any offensive ground type, Marowak must watch out for a crucial component of those teams, which is bulky Will-O-Wisp Gengar, in addition to the numerous other excellent aerial Pokemon that thwart its stab who reign over advance. But it's not impossible to make work, as has been shown. Currently, Marowak is in the underused ban list, but it will be interesting to see if Marowak is merely a lesser used Pokemon popping up as an anti-meta trend, or just like it did in GSC, if it's legitimate or not. Now on to Gen 4 and DPP, everything got faster and stronger, with more residual damage and walls around every corner. With Gliscor coming out at the onset of the generation and the Rotom forms appearing in Platinum, in addition to vicious threats like Infernape and Heatran that outspeed and overpower Marowak without a second thought. To say nothing of other things such as Skarmory gaining recovery, the old Suicune remaining prominent, and big dragons like Salamence and Latias ruling the roost. Marowak unfortunately never stood a chance. It's usable on extremely gimmicky Trick Room teams admittedly, but so is Rampardos, if you need an idea of how viable anything with a high attack stat can be on those squads, which is still pretty bad. And even in underuse, it's still naturally not great because of its low speed and teams packing waters and grasses out the wazoo, but it's definitely usable. It had several points of entry from where it could dish out seriously brutal damage against the likes of defensive stalwarts Chansey and Registeel. On Trick Room teams which were less gimmicky and underused and often backed by the excellent Uxie, he was more at home. However, the prominence of Aquajet Azumarill put somewhat of a thorn in that, and though he wasn't bad, Marowak's overall usage was low enough to drop into never use, where there he was a fine unspectacular member of the tier, but was especially terrifying on Trick Room teams, which were quite good, and also sometimes it took on more of a supporting role with Stealth Rocks. And on to the power creep generation, it's quite possible Marowak has never been seen in black and white overused battles that were at all serious whatsoever, which wouldn't be a surprise to anyone, to be honest. There is simply no upside to it, and if you want a ground type, you can just use Garchomp or Landorus T. There is no inkling of room at all for it to work in the land of Keldeo and Latios. In rarely used, it never had the makings of a consistent Pokemon either, but was definitely viable, as its surroundings were increasingly less able to exploit its many shortcomings. Plus, several excellent Pokemon such as Slowking and UC could easily set up Trick Room, thus meaning Marowak didn't necessarily have to be part of a gimmickier team in order to function. But unfortunately for the most part, same old story, and it continued and never used. And in Gen 5 VGC, specifically 2013, Marowak's Lightning Rod ability, while useless for it alone, is potentially invaluable in a 2-on-2 setting. Being able to draw Thunderbolts and Thunder Waves away from its teammates in a metagame where Thundurus, Cresselia, and Zapdos are fantastic is incredibly valuable and can open its team up for all sorts of havoc. It can also threaten the opposing team back with Bonemerang, which unlike Earthquake, doesn't threaten its partner, and Rock Slide, which of course hits both opposing Pokemon. So it's also not just sitting there drawing electric attacks. His higher power, speed, and lack of a 4x weakness led it to being used over Rhyperior, and while it was still a niche pick, Sage and Park quite impressively reached top 5 at Worlds with it, using it to protect his Tornadus and Jellicent from Thundurus. Now on to Gen 6, not even in never use could Marowak successfully carve out a niche. It had a ton of ground type competition from Piloswine, Rhydon, and Golurk who could do other things well. He dropped down to the lowest of the low, PU. It struggled even there with the prominence of Knockoff threatening to remove its thick club. In VGC 2014, Marowak was even more niche than before, with a plethora of new Pokemon far overshadowing it, but it could still exist and do what it did in 2013, as Thundurus showed no signs of stopping its dominance. It even made a top 32 Worlds appearance on Eloy Han's team. But in 2015, Marowak's usage was even more unimpressive than before. It only appeared once on Javier Madrid's team, who used it to reach top 4 at Phoenix Fall Regional. And we'll remember Marowak's potential niche as being decent in these metagames, but in 2016 when all the legendaries came down, it was likely never even given a thought. And then in the 7th generation, Vanilla Marowak continued to be wholly unremarkable in every way, as it was for the past 3 generations, and regular Marowak dropped to PU. But the new Fire Ghost Alolan Marowak, complete with a new stab move in Shadow Bone, was of much intrigue. Steel losing its resistance to Ghost in Generation 6 now meant that Marowak had a stab it could easily spam and hit everything hard with, in addition to its terrific secondary fire typing. Plus, it could even use the full power of Flare Blitz with no recoil thanks to Rock Head. Now, many Pokemon have cool offensive combinations, and haven't we just discussed how Marowak is slow and frail and has bad weaknesses? Isn't that still the case with the Alolan form? You'd be right, but it's got different weaknesses, and perhaps more notably, it's got different strengths that happen to work much better for it. If it comes in on Ferrothorn, suddenly everything is going to get hit really hard. It's much harder to pivot around Shadow Bone like there is Earthquake. Plus, its new typing was incredible. It completely destroyed the new soon-to-be uber Pokemon Pheromosa, and if it chose to use Rock Head in favor of Lightning Rod, Tapu Koko and its Volt Switch were completely blanked, with Tapu Koko's secondary Fairy Stab being useless in the face of Marowak's new Fire typing. Now, in the early days of Sun and Moon, Marowak found a niche as a high-maintenance but high-reward offensive-defensive Pokemon. Trick Room teams were surprisingly viable in Sun and Moon, with Magearna being an amazing setter and abuser, and Marowak was of course at the forefront, blowing through Celesteelas and Toxapexes everywhere. It could even be an offensive supporter with Stealth Rock and Will-O-Wisp. It was truly unique and effective on all sorts of teams, and ever since Generation 6, Ghost types are not trappable by abilities, and thus Alolan Marowak's ability to escape Dugtrio allowed it to become an excellent stall breaker with Swords Dance. That is, until Dugtrio began running pursuit for it. Quagsire rose up as well as a popular unaware Pokemon to wall it. Eventually, with Tyranitar resurging in the metagame and actually trapping Marowak effectively now, in addition to Pheromosa being banned and Tapu Koko running U-turn, Marowak fell out of favor. It now resides in Rarely Used and only makes rare appearances on Trick Room teams and Overuse. The plethora of Pursuit and Underuse doesn't do it many favors either, whereas there are usually superior options in Rarely Used. Alolan Marowak was a product of its time, being a new toy that handled a ton of other new toys, and we'll remember it for what it did in those early days of Sun and Moon. Now on to VGC, Lightning Rod was back and on a more overall useful Pokemon, with Tapu Koko's prominence in addition to the impenetrable wall of Celesteela and the fearsome grass-type Tapu Bulu. The fire-type Alolan Marowak was ready for some prime action in this season. Trick Room is of course a prime strategy in VGC, and that offensive threat was yet another layer of depth to Marowak's game, but it could also even use Parasong. The combination of Celesteela and Marowak seemed amazing at first, since in addition to Marowak covering the omnipresent Koko's Thunderbolt, Steela could use Wide Guard to handle Earthquakes, Rock Slides, and Muddy Waters. However, later on in the metagame, it was discovered how effective the 50% berries were, and how easily Arcanine could activate them with Flare Blitz. And on top of this, since Marowak pretty much had to use Thick Club all the time over items that could heal it, it lacked recovery and struggled when Tapu Fini became a lot more common. Kartana also later gained usage after that, but the presence of Arcanine's Intimidate and Recovery meant it was much more effective at handling Kartana than Marowak. At Worlds, however, Marowak made a reappearance because it was just that effective against Tapu Koko, and it was also pretty effective against Arcanine too, which is a really big deal. As for notable Marowak placings, there's actually too many to count, especially in early 2017. But at the San Jose Regionals, Enos Shakar aka Human placed second, Rob Akershoik reached first at the Dutch Open, in Salt Lake City Kyle Hudson reached second, Hayden McTavish made second in Seattle, and in Mexico City Alexis Hernandez reached first. Finally, Paul Ruiz ended up reaching third at Worlds, and as it turns out, the winner of all of it, Ryota Otsubo, also packed a Marowak himself. He in particular used a careful variant with Brick Break. Man, just look at how far Marowak came from those despondent days of forgettability. And finally, in 2018, Incineroar completely destroys Marowak, and thus the latter was sadly dropped off the map once more. But perhaps one day it will return to the spotlight. And that's it. So how good was Marowak actually? Unfortunately, thanks to its weaknesses being as crippling as they are, it's had a bone or two to pick with the majority of the metagames it's seen. In the first, 4th, 5th, and 6th generation, it was just flat out bad, but luckily its Alolan form had a spark in Sun and Moon. That unfortunately too fell out of favor later on. In Advance it's decently usable, but in GSC it cannot be stressed enough how absolutely excellent it is. In VGC its Lightning Rod gave it quite the niche, and it even won a World. However, those days seem to be over with the prominence of Incineroar. The generational shifts by and large have been quite cruel to Marowak, so let's just try and remember its good old days. Thanks for watching everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False White Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and as always, as I always say, comment on what Pokemon you want to see next. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to all of you watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms, yada yada yada. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.